I hope you had a great dinner. I am so honored and thrilled to present two colleagues, but more importantly, two friends here to talk to you all about these joint resolutions of disapproval. The panel tonight is called Legislation and Arms Control, Senator Sanders' Push to Block Offensive Weapons to Israel. This panel will feature experts on arms control and Pentagon spending, addressing the role of U.S. weapons in unlawful attacks in Gaza and Lebanon, and the implications of arms sales to Israel on regional stability. It's also going to give you exactly the information you're going to need to know to be very successful in your lobby visits tomorrow. How many people here are lobbying their senators tomorrow? Yes, okay. I don't know who planned the annual meeting, but this could not have come at a more fortuitous moment to have like over 100 lobbying meetings right before a historic vote on Capitol Hill. And it's not just an important moment for Capitol Hill. In recent weeks, a relentless and indiscriminate campaign in northern Gaza has killed scores of civilians through mass casualty strikes, including one on a residential building in Bethlehem that killed over 90 people, 25 of them children, and there's been heavily restricted humanitarian access across northern Gaza. And what the IPC is now warning of an imminent famine. So John and Elizabeth, they are, again, two dear colleagues. I'm going to kick it over to Elizabeth Regevi first. She's the Middle East and North Africa Advocacy Director for Amnesty International USA. In this role, she leads Amnesty's USA advocacy on human rights issues across the MENA region. Prior to this, she served as Levant researcher with the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies based in Tunis, Tunisia. Elizabeth has conducted human rights advocacy on Palestine and Syria at the United Nations, the European Union, and before national governments in close collaboration with local civil society organizations. She has an MA in Middle Eastern Studies from Columbia and a BA in government from Georgetown University. We'll give her a round of applause. So, Elizabeth, can you walk us through Amnesty's research on the specific weapon sales implicated in these JRDs, such as the JDAMs and the 120 millimeter shells? And what are some of the overarching long-standing patterns of violations by Israeli forces using U.S. weapons in Palestine? And what are the key reasons why Amnesty is calling for an arms embargo?
3 questions, right? So to get started, I'll start a bit broadly about Amnesty's research. So right now, Amnesty is one of the only international human rights organizations with a presence on the ground in the occupied Gaza Strip. This is due to the fact that Gaza is largely inaccessible, enough that we have a field worker on the ground who is Palestinian himself with his family that is there. He's working under unimaginable conditions. He has done heroic work to identify U.S. weapons that have been used in unlawful. He's been doing this all while trying to ensure his own survival and that of his family. And for that, he deserves all of the awards. But in addition to the great work of our field worker, we have a number of amazing teams that have contributed to Amnesty's investigations. We have experts on Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, weapons experts, technology experts. Our investigations include a wide range of activities. This includes visits to attack sites, right? And during this, they can, in some cases they haven't been able to, but find shrapnel from the exploded weapon that was used to identify exactly what type of weapon was used and its make and origin, which has been really critical to the work that we've been doing here with respect to the U.S. government's role in what has been happening in Gaza, conducting interviews with survivors and witnesses, collecting their testimony, analyzing photos and videos, analyzing satellite imagery, and many, many more activities. So from that, I want to go specifically into some of the trends and patterns that Amnesty has documented both over the last 13 months, but I think touching a bit also on on historical violations. And then I'm going to touch a little bit on some of the specific attacks where Amnesty has identified. In most of the cases, I'm going to talk about US-made weapons or weapons that are relevant to the joint resolutions of disapproval that you'll be having meetings about tomorrow. So over the last 13 or so months at this point, Amnesty has published a number of reports investigating attacks by Israeli forces across the occupied Gaza Strip, as well as some attacks in Lebanon. And in Amnesty's conclusion, these have all amounted to war crimes. In Gaza specifically, Amnesty has identified a pattern of unlawful attacks by Israeli forces that have struck civilians and civilian objects over the last year. But importantly, this pattern is consistent with Amnesty's documentation of a longstanding pattern of attacks by Israeli forces against civilians and civilian objects, reckless attacks that amount to war crimes. And these also took place in Gaza during the 2008-2009 conflict, 2014 and 2021 conflicts. So with respect to our most recent investigation, so here I'm really kind of limiting myself to the last 13-month period. Amnesty's investigations have identified a range of weapons used, some of which are included in the JRDs, some of which were also US made, but are not included in this current round of JRDs. So out of Amnesty's investigations in this period, we've identified US made munitions or components of munitions in at least 6 out of the total 20 attacks that we've investigated so far. And these include cases both from Gaza and Lebanon. In each of these cases, we've concluded that the attack amounted to a war crime. And so I was already clear about the weapons that were identified in 6 of those attacks. You might be asking, well, what about the other attacks? So in the other attacks, either Amnesty was not able to identify the exact type of weapon used or its origin, or identified it as having a different origin. So for example, a weapon that was Israeli made, right? So I'm going to quickly go through a few specific cases that Amnesty's investigated, but I do want to be clear, right? It's just a few examples. Really, it's merely just a scratching of the surface of the reality of the scale of destruction and devastation that has taken place in Gaza over the last year. And Amnesty is just one organization, and we can only do so much. So out of the 20 attacks that we've investigated, I'm going to talk about four specific ones. So with respect to JDAMs specifically, do they know what JDAMs are? Sure, yeah. And you jump in if I'm not a weapons expert myself, but so I'll start with JDAMs. JDAMs are one of the weapons that are in those joint resolutions of disapproval. JDAM stands for Joint Direct Attack Munition. So what it is actually is a precision guidance kit that can be attached to a bomb. So the JDAM in and of itself is not an explosive device, but it's attached to the weapon for targeted precision when it is fired, dropped from a plane. What's the term? Dropped from a warplane, right? So that is what a JDAM is in essence, okay? So I've got 2 specific cases where Amnesty identified US made by Boeing, JDAM weapons that were used in unlawful attacks on Palestinian families. So one attack occurred on October 10th, 2023. So I'm taking you back to last year. At approximately 8:30 p.m. at night, an Israeli airstrike hit a family home in Deir al-Balah, and this is in Gaza, and killed 21 members of the An-Najjar family. So one family, 21 members gone. It also killed their 3 neighbors. Among those killed, 7 children. And as I mentioned, it was a Boeing JDAM kit that was found by our field worker. We identified it from the shrapnel. And this kit was attached to a 2,000-pound bomb, a massively, massively destructive weapon to be using in such a densely populated area like the occupied Gaza Strip, right? Another horrific incident, October 22nd, 2023. This attack occurred at around 12 p.m. So there was an Israeli strike on the Abu Mu'alak family home. And this was also in the same city in Deir al-Balah. It killed about 18 members of the family, including 12 children, as well as one neighbor. Likewise, a Boeing JDAM kit was identified from the rubble. And in this case, it was attached to what was likely a 1,000-pound bomb. So also incredibly destructive type of weapon that was used. Both of these cases, Amnesty is calling for them to be investigated as war crimes. And I would just also like to add for these two specific cases, Amnesty International did not find any indication that there were any military objectives at the sites of the two strikes, or that people in the buildings were legitimate military targets. And so these two strikes are, I think, illustrative cases of the various airstrikes that Amnesty has investigated over this period. We have seen that airstrikes have wiped out entire families. They have hit homes full of families, oftentimes at night, right, when families are kind of home for the evening, oftentimes without effective warning or any warning in a lot of cases, and resulting in massive loss of life. There are no words. So as I'd mentioned, right, there are a number of weapons that Amnesty's also identified that are not included in the JRDs. So I just talked about JDAMs. This is one type of precision guidance kit that can be attached to bombs. But I'm not going to get into details, but we have identified as well in some other airstrikes, some other types of US weapons that have been used that were also guidance bomb kits used in very similar incidents where, as I was mentioning, right, family homes or civilian areas. In one case, we had a church, some other areas where illegal airstrikes had taken place with significant civilian loss of life. And so I'm going to move now to the other key weapon that Amnesty has identified being used in attacks by Israeli forces, and that is in the joint resolutions of disapproval. So this is the 120 millimeter tank rounds, right? So this is the munition that is fired from tanks by ground forces operating both in Gaza and along the border between Israel and Lebanon as well. And so this will be our first Lebanon case that I'm going to talk about. This case occurred on October 13th in 2023. This actually got a lot of media attention, so you might recall this case, but a group of 6 journalists were operating in southern Lebanon. They were operating on a hilltop, an open hilltop, clearly marked as press with press vests, pressed helmets. On their car had painting on the top marked TV. They were doing everything they could to be visibly seen from multiple directions. We are journalists. We're operating in an open hilltop with nothing to hide. And they were also very far away from the fighting that they were trying to report on. Unfortunately, this group was then hit with a double tank attack. So they were struck first. That first tank strike killed Reuters journalist Issam Abdullah and injured others in the group. About 37 seconds later, a second tank strike hit the group, causing further damage and injuries to the journalists there. They were clearly marked journalists, visible from all directions, far from fighting. They had also been monitored for about 40 minutes before the first strike hit. There was an Israeli Apache helicopter in the sky, and likely what was an Israeli drone. So the Israeli military should have known that this were a group of journalists and therefore not a military target. And yet they were attacked. Likewise, this case amounts to a war crime. In this case, Amnesty found that the munition used were the 120 millimeter tank rounds. In this specific case, it was not US made, it was an Israeli made tank round. So you might ask, why is that relevant then if we're trying to focus on US made munitions? But what this shows, is clear illegal use of this exact type of weapon in armed conflict by Israeli forces. And so the US government should not be resupplying them with this specific type of weapon that they've already used illegally. We have one more case. This one is from Gaza, and this one also involves tank fire. This one is from May of this year, so May 28th to be specific. In this case, the Israeli military fired at least 3 tank shells at a location in the El Mawasi area of Rafah. And this particular area had been designated as a humanitarian zone by the Israeli authorities. So the tank fire that struck the area, it killed at least 23 civilians. And in this group, there were at least 12 children killed and many more were injured. And I'll just go a little bit more into detail. So in this case, Amnesty's research found that the apparent targets of the attack were one Hamas and one Islamic Jihad fighter. However, regardless of their presence, this strike failed to distinguish between civilians and military objectives by using unguided munitions in an area that was densely crowded with civilians sheltering in tents. And it is therefore that this was a likely indiscriminate attack that should also be investigated as a war crime. So these are just four cases out of so many, and some of the ones from Amnesty's research that I wanted to highlight with you today. I'm happy to answer further questions about investigations that may come later from the audience. And lastly, just to really quickly touch on the arms embargo call, and I can expand on it later if there's further questions. Why do we need an arms embargo? Amnesty's call for an arms embargo in this context is longstanding. It predates the last 13 months. It goes back many, many years. Amnesty's call for an arms embargo is comprehensive in that Amnesty applies it to all parties to the conflict, but I do want to zone in a bit more specifically on how Amnesty views the importance of the arms embargo with respect to the Israeli government specifically, since that is what we are here to talk about. So for decades now, Amnesty has documented and investigated violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law by Israeli authorities. Today, I've talked really specifically about military attacks, but the violations go far beyond that to the expansion of illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank, arbitrary detention of Palestinians on a wide scale in which they're held in conditions where they suffer widespread and systematic torture and other ill treatment, demolition of homes, right? The 17-year illegal blockade of the Gaza Strip, and I could keep going, but I'll stop there. So given these widespread and systematic violations that are existing, Amnesty has called on the international community and not specific, but all national governments to suspend the transfer of weapons to the Israeli government to ensure that they are not contributing to an illegal situation that is a violation of international law, but also to ensure that these governments are not being complicit, right? They are at a very high risk of complicity in these violations that are committed when they are handing across the weapons that can be used to do so. And then just to close, right, when I'm talking about the arms embargo for Amnesty, that is tied to the Israeli government's compliance with international law. So calling for an arms embargo will not end until that happens. The end of the illegal occupation and the dismantlement of the apartheid system over all Palestinians. Thank you.
Your work is just so foundational to our movement and what Amnesty has provided, and your colleague in Gaza, it's just incredible. So we're so grateful and glad to be in this meeting, seriously. John Randing Chapel, another friend. He's an advisor on legal and policy issues in Civics U.S. program where he engages with U.S. policymakers and advocates to enhance the protection of civilians in conflict. His work focuses on U.S. law and policy related to civilian Yet we've seen virtually no accountability over the past year and even longer, as we know. So can you give us a little bit more context on what are the specific provisions of U.S. law and policy and how they can and should apply to weapon sales to the government of Israel?
Yeah, thank you so much, Hassan. And thanks to all of you. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here with you at this critical moment and to be in solidarity with you and with Palestinian civilians. I want to take a moment actually to just process some of what Elizabeth said, because that is unbelievably heavy stuff, right? Like we're talking about now 13 months of Palestinian civilians in Gaza living under constant bombardment, not knowing where they're going to get their next meal, not knowing if they're going to be able to get clean water, not knowing what the fate of their children and their nieces and nephews and their parents and their grandparents is going to be. Let's just let that sink in first. That's the scale of devastation that we have seen in the last year. And it's devastation that's been enabled by the US government. It's been devastation that's enabled by the continued provision of weapons paid for by our tax dollars. Now, US law and policy has provisions that deal with these issues. For decades, since the 1970s, there have been laws that tried to prevent exactly this sort of situation. Laws like Section 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act that prohibits weapons sales to governments that engage in a consistent pattern of gross violations of human rights. Later on, in the 1990s, Congress passed the Humanitarian Aid Corridor Act, now Section 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act, which prohibits military aid to governments that break the delivery of US humanitarian aid. And yet, we've seen that over the past 13 months, despite the pattern of violations that Elizabeth described, despite continued restrictions on the delivery of humanitarian aid to hungry people, that the flow of weapons has continued. That is simply morally unacceptable. And as Elizabeth said, it's threatened to make the United States and our government complicit in the suffering that is unfolding in Gaza. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about Section 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act, because this was a year ago a pretty little known provision of law. It's not something that you would have found a lot of writing about, but it has become really crucial to the advocacy that folks have been doing to try to stop US arms sales to Israel in the midst of these atrocity crimes. And so there have been several important touch points where the US government has put the Netanyahu government in Israel on notice that it has to allow for humanitarian aid to flow. One of those was back in May, and there was a major report on the Israeli government's violations of international law, on strikes that resulted in harm to civilians, and on restriction on humanitarian access. But despite the findings of that report, the flow of military aid and arms sales continued. Just yesterday, we had the 30-day deadline that was defined in a letter sent about a month ago. So a month ago, Secretary Austin and Secretary Blinken sent a letter to the Israeli cabinet saying that they gave actually a list of very specific criteria, saying that we need to see improvements in these areas when it comes to humanitarian access. And if we don't see that, then there could be consequences for US arms. Now, let me be clear, there's no grace period in the law, and it's for a long time been a violation of US law to continue arms transfers. But the letter set forth this 30-day deadline. And despite the gravity of the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, Secretary Blinken, in a press conference, was it today or was it yesterday? Today, yeah, yesterday, one or the other, today or yesterday, found that nothing has to change, that the Israeli government, they might not be doing enough, but when it comes to weapons, we're going to continue sending them. And so I think this is a good place maybe to talk for a second about these joint resolutions of disapproval. So the authority over arms transfers in US law in the Constitution belongs to Congress. It's the Foreign Commerce Clause gives the authority to Congress to control arms exports and exports of any other products. But arms exports is what's important here. And back in the 1970s, Congress passed a law called the Arms Export Control Act, and that created a framework. There were a lot of very big arms sales that Congress didn't know anything about. There were some big scandals, and Congress decided we need to know when there are major arms sales that could involve us in strategic blunders and human rights abuses, in escalatory spirals. And they created a mechanism where they could pass resolutions to stop specific arms sales after they were notified. That's why we're here today, because Senator Sanders has introduced a set of joint resolutions of disapproval on 6 specific arms sales to Israel, and he's going to force a vote on them next week. It's like Wednesday is going to be the day of the vote. And so this is only going to be the second clean vote on arms from the United States to Israel since the beginning of this war in Gaza. It's going to be the first time ever in the 50-year history of this structure that Congress will vote on a joint resolution of disapproval to block an arms sale to Israel. And so that's the opportunity that's in front of us. The opportunity to speak out, to send a clear message to the Biden administration, to the incoming Trump administration, to the Netanyahu government, that the status quo is unacceptable and that the Senate, the American people, everyone here will not stand for the absolute devastation that we've seen wrought with US weapons. I can't remember what the question was. But...
No, that's good. You did good. Okay. So this is to both of you. We're about to do these meetings. We have a whole bunch of meetings with Republicans, Democrats, people on the target list, people off the target list. They all matter. What are the dynamics going into tomorrow's lobby day that everyone here needs to know about? Like, what are you hearing on the Hill? Yeah, just tell us what the dynamics are.
Do you want me to start?
Yeah.
Okay, I can start. Every office is different. Some offices track this constantly. They are always talking to people about foreign affairs issues. They are sometimes engaging with the US State Department or with the intelligence agencies and have opportunities to ask questions and take in information and have an exchange. Some of them will have even recently spoken to Israeli government officials and had an opportunity to press them. Others don't. For some of the people you're going to be talking to, Israel, Gaza, and Lebanon are not on their agenda every day. They might have seen reports, whether from media like CNN and NPR, or maybe on their social media feeds about the situation in Palestine. But that's not going to be every member. It's not going to be every person who you talk to. And so it's important to meet people where they are. Sometimes you're going to find that a lot of things that seem obvious to you and I might not be obvious to the people you're talking to. There are going to be a range of responses when you're talking to staffers about these issues. Some of them are going to probably pivot in ways that are frustrating to you. They're going to talk about issues that might not feel relevant to you or that might feel overly speculative. I think that one of the most important things that you can do is follow follow your moral compass to the reasons that you care about these issues, the reasons that you're on the Hill advocating for peace. Because I think that even despite the unbelievable suffering that we've seen in the last year, there is still a lot of hesitance to change the status quo. And that's really unfortunate. But that's why it's so important to talk to everyone, to meet them where they are, and to point to your passion, your care, and also the evidence to show why there has to be a change. That's a few of my initial thoughts. I guess the last thing that I'll say here is that we're talking about a vote in the Senate. And so the situation in the House, are they meeting only with Senate offices?
We have
Sean?
House meetings too,
You
so
have House
maybe
meeting
if you
offices.
both want to
Cool. Yeah.
describe a little bit
That's great.
about, we're asking folks to request for public statements,
Yeah.
Supporting the JRDs, supporting, stopping offensive weapons
Yeah.
on the House side. But yeah, if you want to speak to that as
Yeah,
well.
I'll say a quick word there then. So in the House, we've seen a lot of members take some bold stances on the behalf of Palestinian civilians in the last year. Folks like Rashida Tlaib, you might have seen her in protest with a sign when Benjamin Netanyahu was giving an address to the US Congress. Folks like Ilhan Omar, many members of the House have taken strong stances. When it comes to this joint resolution disapproval vote, though, the focus is on the Senate. And the reason is that the Senate has the ability to force votes on joint resolutions of disapproval. And so the immediate call for a yes vote on the joint resolutions of disapproval applies to the Senate, because that is where any single member is able to force a vote and take it to the floor. And that's what Senator Sanders is going to be doing next week. The last thing that I'll say maybe on Senate versus House is that Senate offices, it is generally, as I said earlier, there's going to be a range of familiarity with these issues and with foreign affairs issues writ large. It's going to be especially true, I think, in the House. Because in the House, people tend to have fewer staff members. Even the best staffed member office in the Senate has 3 people who focus on foreign affairs. In the Senate, or in the House, what I just said applies to the Senate. I can't remember if that's what I said. In the House, it could only be one person, and that could be split with, for example, space and technology and veterans. And again, I think that speaks to the need to kind of meet people where they are and have the, assume good intent and don't be afraid to explain why you're here and why you care. So I think that that's coming from constituents can be some of the most powerful things.
I don't know that I have much to add. I think I would just say that, you're in a different place than us when you can go and have these conversations, because you're constituents. And so it's going to land in a different way, and it has a different power. And so own that. And I think it's also powerful when you can explain or tell, why does this matter to you? Why are you so affected by this issue or what you're seeing, that you feel so passionately that you want to go and talk to your elected representatives and make these asks of them? They should hear those stories. Maybe you have family there. Maybe you visited the region and you feel a connection to it. Maybe it's just the news you're seeing every day. It's affected you, and you don't want to see it anymore, and you want the US government to stop fueling it. I think those things are important. And then I think the other aspect that I would add is that this JRD vote is an incredibly important opportunity, but it's not the end. They need to, if you are passionate about this issue, you care about this issue, you want to see change, You can't stop tomorrow. They have to keep hearing from you. It is so critically important that they continue to hear from constituents that they care about this issue and they want policy change, and they want policy change now.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Could I say one more word, Hassan?
Please,
Sorry.
yeah, of course.
I thought of something else.
Do not
after I interrupted
apologize, you
Elizabeth.
got it.
There are 6 sales and 6 joint resolutions of disapproval. Elizabeth has already told you very well about a couple of them, and those are the sales for joint direct attack munitions. Again, that's a type of precision guidance kit that's attached to a bomb, and the sale of 120mm tank shells. There are 4 others. I'm just going to run through what they are, because one dynamic that you should be aware of is that some offices are comfortable opposing certain sales and not others. Maybe after this, I'll turn it to Elizabeth, because I think that you'll probably have some thoughts on this and things that you've heard from offices as well. So we have joint direct attack munitions, 120mm tank shells. Then we have joint direct attack munitions receivers. This is a part that involves a GPS receiver that communicates with the JDAM and the bomb in order to facilitate targeting. So that's number 3. Number 4, and this is not in order, sorry. Number 4 is mortar shells. So this is like a small, relatively close range artillery. It's also 120mm in caliber, and it's used pretty extensively in populated areas and urban areas in the Gaza Strip in ways that are incredibly dangerous to civilians. Then you have tactical vehicles that have been used in human rights abuses and in the West Bank, and also that raise real concerns about facilitating operations in Gaza. Lastly, you have F-15s. Those are US warplanes that are able to drop bombs. And so when we look at all of the many strikes that Elizabeth has described, and also many of the strikes that you'll have seen or been familiar with in the last year, these were using bombs that were dropped from planes from the United States. These F-15s is a $18 billion sale of more planes. So those are the 6 sales. And offices see them in different ways. I don't think that you have to know all the technical arguments about every sale. I think that you should feel free to keep things at a pretty high level. I'll say that it's likely that not all of the 6 receive a vote. And as I said, when it comes to kind of meeting members and their staffs where they are, if someone is willing to vote against or vote in favor of one of the joint resolutions of disapproval, but not one of the others, then that's okay. And I think that you can try to figure out where their lines are and what they're willing to support and not. And that is also a really helpful thing to do and a good conversation to have.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think maybe just one thing to add to that, which is that I think we find offices or just US officials more generally, they very much like to get into the weeds and focus either on specific attacks or specific weapons. But we're past that. We have a massive pattern of violations. So scrutinizing this weapon, this attack, that attack. We're on a higher, what did I say? I mean, we're beyond that. I think I'll just go with what I said the first time. We're beyond that. So I think that's something that you can lean into, is that the pattern is so incredibly disturbing that the US should not be giving weapons in this context. And that, I mean, that's a blanket kind of reasoning you can give for the 6 JRDs in this case.
And I'll say one last sentence maybe, which, because it is something that was almost certain to come up in your meetings, that there are certain types of military equipment that many people in the Senate believe the Israeli government should keep receiving because they are seen as defensive. So this is missile defense equipment that you might have heard referred to before as Iron Dome or David Sling. The only sentence that you need to know about this for now is that the 6 JRDs do not implicate missile defense like Iron Dome or David Sling.
Let's give our panelists a round of applause. What do you say? Okay. We want to hear a few questions from all of you. Our dear friend Hadia has the microphone. There might be another, Tanzania also has a microphone. Let's take a couple questions and then give them a final word, and then everybody can rest up and get ready for a lot of lobbying tomorrow. Maybe say your name and where you're from, maybe even who your senators are that you're meeting with tomorrow. So we could give tailored advice.
We have one over here.
Please.
Actually, I have a couple. As I'm reading that list, I don't see any mention of white phosphorus bombs. And maybe the technical term is there and I just don't know it. And I'm concerned about that and comments. Secondly, there is something we're really not talking about, which is the role of AIPAC in all of this, the American Israel Political Action Committee. And the third thing, I got something that I can get through WhatsApp, but I'm not able to send it any outside of WhatsApp, that seems to indicate the official total is of verified deaths. But the Lancet, for example, is estimating over 200,000 deaths that haven't been recognized. And I wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah. Briefly, go ahead.
Yeah, white phosphorus, great question. I'm going to turn it to Elizabeth in a moment to talk about some of what they've seen at Amnesty regarding white phosphorus. I'll say specifically why it's not in the list of joint resolutions of disapproval. And that is because a joint resolution of disapproval has to pertain to a notified sale. And a notified sale, frankly, we've had very few notified sales. The US government has used different mechanisms to enable transfers without notifying Congress. More than 100 without congressional notification. The reason that white phosphorus is not on that list is largely because there has not been a notification for a sale of white phosphorus. And that means there cannot be a joint resolution disapproval on it. A lot of the white phosphorus that has been used is older. And I'll turn it over to Elizabeth.
Yes, I mean, I guess what I can just say is Amnesty has documented unlawful use of white phosphorus by Israeli forces, specifically in southern Lebanon. These were attacks that took place in October. Amnesty did document that white phosphorus was used in Gaza, but didn't come to a legal conclusion about that. In both cases, they were US origin white phosphorus shells.
Really quick on, if I may, on the Lancet study. FCNL, and a lot of the things that we have published when we cite the statistics of how many deaths in Gaza, we're saying the official count, and then we actually go ahead and then cite the Lancet study, which said, several months ago is 186,000 due to indirect deaths. So we're totally with you that we have to, give that full range. And just quickly on AIPAC, that's why we're here. There are a lot of people lobbying on the other side of this, and your power is exactly what we need, more than ever. But please.
I think I would add just a little bit about the death count. I mean, so the Amnesty, the UN, a number of organizations, the number that they're relying on is what is coming from the Gaza Health Ministry. Those are the confirmed deaths, which is a part of the picture because they're operating under incredibly difficult circumstances, if not able to have been able to document all of the deaths that have occurred or even access areas. So it's not a complete picture, but that's the reason that Amnesty and other organizations you might be looking at their websites like UN. That's who they're citing to.
Today, AIPAC started running ads in 17 states against these joint resolutions of disapproval. And I gotta say, the thing that makes me more confident than anything is the number of people and the number of meetings that we've got in this room. And people power is going to matter more.
Yeah, they feel like they have to run ads in 17 states. So.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for FCNL. I always have it wrong for organizing this. My name is Sena. I'm from Illinois, and I'm really happy to be here, and obviously from Amnesty and all the speaker previously. Okay, sorry. Oh, okay. So my question is this. We obviously, I think I remember it was a priest or somebody say last year, Gaza will survive. Will we survive? That's what I feel like. I don't think we are surviving what we're seeing. So my question is, for example, the term usage, Amnesty use, is war crime. To me, it's beyond war crime, beyond genocide that is recorded in any intention or by the law. Why is it Amnesty, an organization such is, as much as you're doing great work, given the situation, saying it's like war crime? Why are we not? And that's my first question. And second question, it is, I think the young lady over there asked earlier, I mean, if 200 is killed, that is too small. We are talking in a small such a place, 80,000 bomb, if I'm not mistaken, is thrown in that area. I mean, it is, the number is, it belittles it. The reality, it belittles it, and it's painful to kind of, you undermine the language you use, the fact that you're not calling what it is, genocide, what it is, I think it's wrong, and why are you guys doing that? And the last question I ask is, the US government obviously breaking its own law. I came to this country as a refugee, and everybody saw America as a city up on the hill. We look into, but the last 1 year have made America this a country to be ashamed for its action it did. So Israel is taking America itself, and as an American citizen, it breaks my heart. The American lawmakers, the Congress, are in the packet of APAC. So what option is out there when we are facing such a mountain of powerful people? Thank you.
I can take the third first.
Which one?
I can take the third one first.
If you want.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, turn over.
Okay.
The stakes are very high, and the odds are hard. It always seems impossible until it's done. That's one of the things that I have stuck with in this last year of unbelievably difficult and devastating work. It is going to be a lot of work and time and effort in order to affect a change, and in order to try to, try to begin to reckon with the immense scale of the harm and the complicity that we've seen. But it starts places like this. It starts with talking to your elected representatives, and I think it's immensely important that your senators hear that where the Congress is out of step with where the people are. And the polling says that, right? Like, people have done many studies at this point that indicate this. I think it's about making it real for them, putting a face on that, and showing that you're not going to stand for the deep moral corrosion that we've seen set in the last year. I'll turn it over to Elizabeth.
Yeah, I think I can build on that, and then I'll answer the other questions. But I think we're all there with you, that it is overwhelming. There are no words anymore for what we see every day, and we're more than a year into this. And I think we all struggle with, continuing to go every day, but the challenges are significant. But I think what I hold on to is that there have been real shifts in the last 13 months. Are they enough to meet the needs of the people in Gaza right now? No. not by any means. But within the US political environment on this issue, significant shifts had happened, and the fact that this vote is taking place next week, if you had asked me 2 years ago that that would have happened, I wouldn't have believed you. So these things may seem small, and like I said, they're not meeting the moment of the needs of the people on the ground, but it is a shift. And so grab onto the fact that there are shifts happening and keep pushing. So with respect to amnesty, I appreciate your comments. And so I'll just kind of clarify my remarks, and then I can talk a little bit about Amnesty's approach and positions, and hopefully offer some clarity. So in my remarks, I was talking about specific attacks where Amnesty conducted its legal analysis and came to its determination, right? They look at kind of the menu of violations of international law, what's applicable in this case. And so in these cases, it's specifically a military attack, and they're looking at a war crime. And when you're talking about the other crimes, you're looking at kind of the totality of evidence, right? That's a bigger overarching issue. And so Amnesty's investigations that it has been conducting throughout this period, all of that is compounding evidence that's being examined to look at these more overarching crimes and their applicability. So within that, Amnesty has continued to warn of the risk of genocide in this situation, and has called for action from the US government, the international community, and others for the fact that a famine has been engineered by the Israeli government within the occupied Gaza Strip. So those are Amnesty's current positions. Investigations are ongoing to look into the applicability of other international crimes, including the crime of genocide.
Maybe we have time. We don't have a lot of time. I know we have some people online. What I would just urge is that people keep your questions very brief. Make it one question so we can possibly get to more voices. So who's first? Is that Ramsey?
Yes. Greetings. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Well, thank you for taking this question. I'll try to be brief. Clear from what you said, the use of a weapon in carrying out an illegal act like crimes against humanity or war crimes makes the use of that weapon illegal. Now, also, the occupation has been ruled as illegal by the International Court of Justice. Doesn't it therefore mean that all use of weapons by the Israeli military forces in the occupied territories is illegal? Why do we even need to care about whether they're being used for war crimes or crimes against humanity? It's much simpler, surely, isn't it?
Yes, that's a good question. I mean, I think at the end of my remarks, I was talking about the arms embargo call, which I think goes directly to your point. We're talking about the fact that the occupation in and of itself is illegal. Amnesty has that position. A number of organizations, Palestinian organizations, were at the forefront of calling the occupation illegal, and now we have the ICJ advisory opinion. Likewise, Amnesty has concluded that Israel is committing the crime against humanity of apartheid. That crime is being committed against the Palestinian people as a whole, both those living within the occupied Palestinian territory, as well as Palestinian citizens of Israel, and Palestinian refugees and their descendants, be they within Israel and the OPT or external to the areas under Israel's direct control. And so it is because of that Amnesty has the arms embargo call, that governments should not be sending any weapons, providing any training, any kind of military or security equipment to the Israeli government until these violations cease and the Israeli government is in compliance with international law. So that requires the end of the occupation and the dismantlement of the apartheid system. I hope that clarifies things.
Thank you so much. Friends, how are we feeling? We're basically at time. Lauren, what do you think? Do we have time for another question? No, we don't. So that's why I asked her, because I didn't want to be the one that gets blamed, okay? No, but, okay, thank you. Friends, we are so grateful to you for being here And we're so grateful to Elizabeth and John for taking the time to chat with us. Can we give them a big round of applause? I always learn so much from these two. We also have a lot of this information in that packet that you received in your folders, and that handout, a lot about the US law and policy, documented human rights violations, and really everything you need to know for these visits. One thing I will say just in response to Ramsey is that international law matters. To your senators, some of the stuff that John was saying around the US law and policy is going to land really well with them, because that's honestly, a lot of these senators really care about US law and policy. Sometimes they don't really care about international law as much as they should, unfortunately. But I know you're going to have really successful meetings tomorrow, and I cannot wait to read some of those lobby reports, because that's going to be critical as we try to follow up and do more work. So with that, as we wrap up, we're going to pass it to our process observer. And okay, good night. We love you. Okay. And we wish you were here, but thank you, Zoom people and friends. And what else do we do? Okay, we're closing the panel.